Thank you, praise team, for leading us in worship. It's a joy to sing praises to God and to focus our attention on the one who called us to be his own. Well, our Old Testament reading for this seventh Sunday after Epiphany is Genesis 45. And it's 15 verses, and I need to read them all for us to have a sense of the story. I know that's a long reading, but so bear with me. Genesis chapter 45, beginning at verse 1. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." And when they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to me, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me, you and your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. I will provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it is really I who am speaking to you. Tell my father about all the honor accorded me in Egypt and about everything you have seen, and bring my father down here quickly." Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept, and Benjamin embraced him weeping, and he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterwards, his brothers talked with him. Now may God add his blessing to the hearing of this word. In this story, as we drop into the life of Joseph, he is wearing the cloak of royalty. He has risen to the position of ruler of all Egypt, one of the greatest nations in the world at that time. He is second only to Pharaoh, who is the king. And Pharaoh has said to Joseph, "Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." My point is that Joseph is a first-class, genuine, card-carrying big shot. But Joseph has not worn this cloak all his life. Before he came to this place and station, he endured great hardship and difficulty, and all of it was unjust and unfair. So let's look at Joseph's other cloaks. And Genesis 37 tells us about his first cloak, and you heard about it probably when you were a child in church, the one that he's most noted for. Israel, his father, also known as Jacob, gives him a richly ornamented or many-colored robe. The Hebrew meaning is uncertain, but there's one thing for sure. It was a nice coat, a very fancy one, particularly for shepherds. And it seems to be a symbol that joy was daddy's pet. Verse 37:3 comes right out and tells us that Joseph was Jacob's favorite. Only little Joey out of all of his children, 12 boys, had such a fancy coat. As we might understand, his half-brothers resented his favoritism. Jacob had more than two wives. He also had children by concubines of his wives. But his favorite wife was Joseph's mother. Now, then Joseph had two dreams. In both dreams, his brothers, even his parents, were bowing down to him and honoring him. Now, he made the mistake of sharing those dreams openly with his family. And you can imagine how that made them feel. You know, sometimes God reveals things to us that are just for us. And we ought to be careful about how we share them. But relating those dreams to the family only infuriated his jealous brothers all the more. Then one day, the half-brothers, are out in the field with the flocks, and they're working. But little Joey's back home with Daddy, and Daddy sends him out in the flocks to check on his brothers. Well, they see him come in and decided this would be a good time to get rid of him. They take his pretty coat, they throw him in a well and leave him there to die. Later, they have second thoughts about killing him, so they get him out of the well, and he gets a new coat, the cloak of slavery. They sell him as a slave to some merchants who are passing by on their way to Egypt. Then they soaked his pretty coat in blood and told Daddy a wild beast got him. But to his credit, Joseph does not allow this horrible injustice to embitter him. He tries to make the most of the situation. And God is with him, giving him great administrative gifts. These merchants who were coming by took him to Egypt, and they sell him to Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's guard, a very high official in the government. Potiphar recognized his gifts, and soon Joseph in charge of his whole household. He's running the whole kit and caboodle. He has the cloak of success. He's as successful as you can be as a slave. But not only is Joseph wise, he is also, quote, well-built and handsome, close quote. And he attracted the attention of Potiphar's lustful wife. She made advances to Joseph, and being an honorable man, he refused, ran out of the house, in the process, left his cloak behind. Now, his rejection made her very angry, and she accuses Joseph of improper advances to her husband, and puts up his coat as evidence that he left it when he fled the house when she refused him. Again, the victim of terrible injustice. Joseph loses his cloak of success and gets the cloak of incarceration in its place. Potiphar throws him in prison. But again, to Joseph's credit, he does not let bitterness and injustice take root in his heart. He does not get mad at God or anyone else, but accepts his circumstances and makes the most of them. He makes use of the gifts that God has given him in the area of administration, and he works hard for his master, and soon he's running the whole prison, the whole jail system. You see, back in those days, the government hired out jails to independent contractors, and that's what this jailer was, and soon Joseph is running the whole prison. Now, as my grandmother used to say, the cream always rises to the top. Now, of course, she didn't live in the days of homogenization when the cream don't rise anymore, but the cream does always rise to the top if it's not homogenized. Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker made him mad, and he threw them in the same prison where Joseph was. They both have dreams they don't understand. And Joseph, who knows about dreams, he's always been a dreamer, and he interprets the dreams for them. And his interpretations were accurate. That was good for the cupbearer. He was restored to his position. but it wasn't so good for the baker. He got hung. It must have been some bad biscuits. Anyway, the cupbearer had promised Joseph when he got out of prison that he would tell Pharaoh about him and help get him out of this jail. But when he got his freedom, he didn't want to approach him. He just kind of forgot about it. And for 2 years, it went on that way. Then Pharaoh had some dreams that no one could interpret. He called all of his magicians and wise men in. No one could interpret the dreams. Then the cupbearer remembers Joseph. And surely figured this will get me in good with Pharaoh too. He said, look, when you threw me in jail, I met this guy in there named Joseph. And he interprets dreams. So Pharaoh calls for Joseph. He interprets the dreams to mean there'll be 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. He tells Pharaoh that God has revealed this to him so he could prepare during the good years, store up, prepare for the years of famine that were to follow. Well, Pharaoh was pleased with Joseph's interpretation, puts him in charge of all the preparations, and even makes him second in command in all of Egypt. Again, now he gets the new cloak, the cloak of royalty, in which we find him in the text. Now, Joseph's brothers show up in Egypt to buy food as this drought and famine has spread all over the region. You know, and here's Egypt and here's Israel, just up the road there where they were from. And so they come to buy food. They hear there's food in Egypt, and they come to buy food. Now, at first, Joseph conceals his identity and forces them to go back home and return with their youngest brother, who was Benjamin. He had stayed home with Daddy, you see, because Joseph and Benjamin had the same mother, and Rachel, who was Jacob's true love. And little Benji had replaced Joey as Daddy's pet. Well, they returned with Benjamin. In our text, Joseph can't stand it any longer, and he reveals his true identity to his brothers. And it says they couldn't even speak, so they were terrified. And yes, they were. Here they were talking to a man who had the power to send them out and have them executed summarily. No trial, no nothing. He had that kind of power. So it was a terrifying experience for them. But Joseph reassures him that everything's cool and sends them after the rest of the family. And then they live and prosper in Egypt for many years, hundreds of years. Now, I have felt the necessity to tell you the story because I didn't want to read 3 chapters of Genesis. You'd be even more bored than you have been with me telling you, but you have to hear the story in order for me to preach the sermon. That's only going to take me about 5 minutes. A lot of bad stuff has happened to Joseph. I mean, terrible things. Can you imagine? And for the most part, he's been a good guy. Still got a little bit full of himself maybe when he was younger. But he had suffered terrible rejection, betrayal, and abuse even from his own family, and injustice at the hands of his masters. One day he is the favored son of a wealthy shepherd. The next he's a commodity for sale. And that's not bad enough. The lies of a scornful, lustful woman land him unjustly in prison. If slavery wasn't bad enough, now he's a convict. Where was God? Where was God in all of this? Why did God allow Joseph to suffer so? His heart was after God. Well, let me suggest to you that it was because he wanted to prepare Joseph for God's preferred future. God had a plan. God knew what was coming down the pipe. And he needed to prepare Joseph for something he wanted him to do. He had a preferred future for Joseph, but God knew that spoiled little Joey would not be capable of giving leadership to the most influential nation in the world unless he learned a few things about life and living. And the best, if not the only way to learn some of these things is through suffering. Amen. You think about all the great men and women you've known in history, and you read their life story, and you'll find that most of them, many of them, if not most, learned and became wise through suffering. So before Joseph could appreciate the privilege of prosperity, he had to feel the pangs of poverty. Otherwise, you can't really understand what really poor people experience unless you've been there. Before Joseph could appreciate the need for justice, he had to feel the injury of injustice, to know what it's like. Before Joseph could appreciate liberty, he needed to experience incarceration. Most of us don't know what it's like to hear those doors close. I remember we used to do prison ministry, and we had to go through all these doors, and they'd lock and they'd close them behind them. And man, when they closed behind you knew you were getting closer. We're going to be in a room with 400 people in a maximum security prison. They were women, but some of them had done some bad stuff, and it felt weird going in. And I can't imagine what it would be like knowing that door's closing, and it's not going to open. We're going to get to leave that night, but they weren't. And particularly if you were unjustly thrown there, and to know you're living in prison, your liberty is gone. But Joseph couldn't appreciate what real liberty was until he experienced that incarceration. Joseph could not appreciate the value of family until he knew the loneliness of isolation. Amen. Lastly, not least, certainly not, Joseph could not appreciate and give godly leadership without knowing that God is the architect of history. We think that we make history, but we are just the tools God uses to write history as he works out his plan and purposes in this world. Amen. Now, one problem we experience in America today is that many, if not most, of our leaders come from among the privileged, and they've not learned a lot of these things. Maybe that is why soldiers who have been POWs and have known difficulty and heartache make good political leaders. Well, Joseph recognized the sovereignty of God even in the midst of unjust suffering. And God used the difficulties of his life, even the wickedness of his brothers and the lying wife of Potiphar, to drive him to absolute dependency on God. He depended on God. And he could see God's hand helping him get through these situations, so that he could say to his brothers, in earnest, from his heart, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. He was just a simple shepherd who knew nothing about the business and politics of running a great nation. Yet that is what God raised him up to do. God was able to do that because Joseph did not allow difficulty, injustice, and hard circumstances to embitter him against God or those who treated him harshly and unjustly. It is if Joseph knew Romans 5 verses 3 and 4 before Paul actually wrote them. The words of this, but we also rejoice in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. Joseph never gave up hope. His hope was in God. He believed that God was in control of his destiny and would use everything that happened to him for good. Why do bad things happen to good people? Well, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, it's to prepare us for God's preferred future. Calling us to learn things, some things that we can only learn through suffering. Amen. Would you pray with me, please? God, would you help us be like Joseph? That we would learn to forgive and to forget. Where we've been mistreated, where we've suffered injustice, rejection, and heartache. Help us to get rid of all bitterness and anger in us because of those things we suffered. And help us to understand that you have been and can continue to use those things as teachers, helping us to become what you want us to be, helping us to be better at what you've called us to be. Help us to understand and take to heart those rules, again, that those words that Paul also wrote. That we know that in all things God works for the good of those who are called according to his purpose. And help us to understand, God, that you are the architect of history. You're the architect of our lives. You know our past. You've been with us in that past. You can help us to overcome the hurts and damages and problems that have come because of that past. You can use all of that to make us into someone that you can use to do great things in your kingdom. So come and minister to us, Lord. Help us all right now, Lord, to just take a minute and search our hearts to those things that have happened to us that were unfair, unjust, and totally uncalled for. Things of which maybe some of us have been angry about. And help us to right now lay them on this altar and say, I forgive and I'm moving on. God, rid my heart of hatred and anger and bitterness and open it to the fullness of your grace, that I might become the person you want me to be, and I can be equipped to fulfill that purpose in the preferred future that you have for me. Come, Lord, and minister to us now.